All right, let's get one thing straight. This isn't just another story about a failed company. We're going to conduct a forensic analysis of what is really a logical tragedy. We need to look at Kodak not as a history lesson, but as a direct and urgent warning for every leader, every executive who's watching this right now. Okay, let's dive in.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the absolute paradox of the Kodak story. They didn't just miss the future, they literally invented it. They understood it, and then they spent the next 3 decades doing everything in their power to run away from it. The question we have to answer is, why?
To really understand the fall, you first have to appreciate the sheer scale of the empire they built. You know, before the collapse, Kodak wasn't just another successful company. It was a force of nature. I mean, we're talking about a true monopoly in every sense of the word.
Let's just stop and think about this number for a second. 90%. That level of market dominance is almost unimaginable today. Back in the 20th century, if you took a picture, it was practically guaranteed that Kodak was getting a piece of that action. And the money they made from that film, wow, just staggering. 70% profit margins on their main product. To put that in perspective, a company like Apple, one of the most profitable in history, runs on margins closer to 25%. So Kodak wasn't just making money, they were basically printing it. At its absolute peak, Kodak was a corporate behemoth worth $28 billion, with over 145,000 employees all over the world. You know, the phrase, a Kodak moment, was literally in the dictionary. They weren't just a brand. They were woven into the very fabric of our culture, of memory itself.
And here's the genius of how they did it. Their business model was just a masterpiece of recurring revenue. They'd sell you the razor, the camera, for next to nothing, because they knew they'd make a fortune selling you the blades, the film, the processing, the prints, over and over again. Every single time you click that shutter, cha-ching, that was a cash register ringing for Kodak.
And this brings us to the real heart of the story, the crazy part. Because the threat that would eventually kill this perfect business model, it didn't come from a competitor out in Silicon Valley. Nope. It came from inside Kodak's own research labs.
So in 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson creates this thing, the world's first digital camera. Now, it was a clunky 8-pound beast. It was slow, the resolution was terrible, but it worked. It was the future right there in his hands. And when he showed it to management, their response became one of the most infamous lines in business history. They saw a toy, not a revolution, and essentially told him to go hide it.
So you really have to understand why they buried it. This slide lays out the brutal, simple math. Their film business was this beautiful, endless river of gold. The digital model? It was a one-time hardware sale with much lower margins. To the leadership at Kodak, embracing digital didn't look like innovation. It looked like financial self-destruction.
This was an actual question from an executive in that 1975 meeting. It's just a perfect example of how they were trapped in their current way of thinking. They weren't just looking at a new piece of tech, they were looking at something that threatened their entire definition of what a photograph even was. Okay, so this gets us to the absolute core of our analysis. Kodak's failure was not a failure of intelligence. Let's be clear about that. It was a failure of incentives. You had smart, rational people making what seemed like individually logical decisions that, when you added them all up, steered the company directly off a cliff.
It is the textbook case of what we call the innovator's dilemma. The theory is that the very systems designed to make a company successful, maximizing profits, hitting quarterly targets, keeping shareholders happy, are the exact same systems that prevent it from making those huge, painful leaps you need to survive disruption.
And on the inside, this dilemma created an echo chamber of perfectly logical-sounding excuses. Every single one of these arguments sounded reasonable at the time. They weren't just ignoring the future, they were building a logical case to justify delaying it. They even had a chilling name for this strategy, managing the decline.
And this slide just boils it all down to the human choice. For any executive in the 90s whose bonus, whose stock options were all tied to short-term performance, while protecting the 70% margins of film was the only rational career move. To champion the low-margin, uncertain world of digital, that would have been professional suicide.
So I'll ask you directly, put yourself in that boardroom. Your family's financial security, your reputation, your entire career is on the line. Are you really going to be the person who stands up and volunteers to destroy the company's golden goose for a future that might not even work? The entire system was designed to produce only one answer.
And this all leads us to the final and maybe the most brutal truth.
At the end of the day, Kodak's failure wasn't about technology, or even really about strategy. It was a failure of identity. They fundamentally misunderstood what business they were actually in.
And this is the fatal mistake right here. Kodak saw themselves as a film and chemical company. Their identity was tied to a physical product. But their purpose was helping people capture and share memories. If they had defined themselves as an imaging company, the shift to digital would have just been a natural evolution, not an existential threat.
And just look at this timeline. It's staggering. 37 years. This wasn't some sudden disruption that came out of nowhere. This was a slow, agonizing decline driven by decades of deliberate, rational, and ultimately fatal choices.
So, the crucial takeaway is this. The tragedy of Kodak wasn't one single bad decision in 1975. It was the thousands of small, logical decisions made every single year after that to protect the present at the expense of the future. It was a death by 1,000 optimizations.
And that really brings us to the final lesson. Kodak's immense success, that 90% market share, those 70% profit margins, it created the very conditions that made it impossible for them to change. Their success became a golden cage. So we'll end by turning this historical analysis into a personal warning. Every organization has its own version of the digital camera, that uncomfortable truth they're all rationally choosing to ignore. The question you have to ask yourself is, what is yours? Because the gap between what you're optimizing for today and what will actually matter in 10 years, that's where companies go to die.